As we market with that blind profile, is we start getting people that are interested, and we start fielding those buyers. Now, it's not, it happens fairly often where somebody who has a very low budget has a very high taste in price of business. So there's a pre-screening process that goes on, and we try to find the right business for that person's financial capacity. And we get other information from them. Obviously, we get a non-disclosure agreement. Everything we do is confidential. So we get the non-disclosure agreement, we get financial information, and then we get what we call our dream sheet. And it tries to measure what that particular buyer is interested in, what things in their life are they interested in. Small business owners know that it can be grueling. You work hard and you work all the time. Even when you're not at work, you're at work. So it needs to be something that you have passion about and that you're excited about. I think we can move to the next slide, and then that would be Carl.
Yeah, the confidentiality is such a key, and that's why the name of our company is Confidential Business Intermediaries. I remember when I was thinking about getting into this business back in 1994, I met with Jim Lindsay, who is a friend of mine, and Jim, of course, is one of the great real estate moguls of Arkansas. And Jim looked at me and very seriously said, "Carl, how do you sell a secret?" And I said, "Jim, I can tell you, but if I do, I'll have to kill you." And we laughed about that, but marketing a secret is something that we have perfected over the past 25 plus years. How do you keep it quiet until you identify the right buyer to whom you're going to begin to disclose things? We have those techniques worked out. Next one, Amy. We talked about the buyer documentation, and we put sellers through a fairly fine screen of gathering the information. We do the same thing with a buyer. One of the worst things that we can have happen is have a prospective buyer come in, waste a seller's time, waste our time, and that buyer is not able to pull that off. Another thing that we found too, Mary Beth, you may have run into this already, is that recently the SBA has become really much more difficult to deal with in terms of prior experience in a certain type of business. So if we've got a heating and air business now that we've got under contract, one of our buyers had experience 7 years ago with HVAC. Well, SBA says that's not enough. You need to have more immediate experience. So we're working to retain one of the high-level employees in the business to help that person be able to obtain the SBA loan. So we're going to make sure that buyer is qualified financially, has the proper motivation and the background to be able to do it. Let's go to the next one. Okay, disclosing the business, and that in and of itself is more of an art than it is science, how we do that. John, you want to pick that up and run with it?
Sure. So once we think that this is the right buyer, or at least a qualified buyer for that business, then we're going to disclose it to them. In doing so, we're going to do that on the phone. We're going to tell them some of the attributes of the company, talk through it. Obviously, we'd love to do it in person, but that doesn't happen as much as it used to. And then we're going to give them access to an online confidential deal room or data room that gives them access to that confidential business review that I mentioned earlier, the brochure that we build. And so it's going to give them that information, and it's going to give them the recasted financials. So they'll be able to see what the financial performance of the company has been over at least a 3-year period. Sometimes we show 3 years, sometimes more, but at least 3-year period, they'll be able to see the financial performance of that company. Then the only thing they can do in that room is go in there and read it. They can't print that stuff off, and they can't email it to themselves or whatever. I suppose they could take a picture of it with their phone or something, but we try to limit that. We try to do nothing on paper because we don't want the confidentiality to be broken. Next one, please, Amy. The next step in the process, after we've disclosed the business and the buyer says, "Hey, I really like this, I want to learn more about it," then we're going to host a buyer-seller meeting. And the purpose of that meeting is to let the two individuals meet each other and visit and talk and hopefully develop good chemistry between them. because they're going to need it. It's a long process, and they need to get along with each other. So we're trying to describe how the business operates, what kind of things that the owner does on a daily basis, so that the buyer gets a view of what his life would be like as an owner of that company. It's not a financial due diligence meeting. That comes later. Carl, you want to take the next one?
Sure. We believe strongly in contingent letters of intent. I don't know how many of you have read the book Rich Dad, Poor Dad, but in that there is a chapter that says make offers, make an offer. And this is our paean to the make an offer. If once the buyer and seller have met one another, the buyer has already seen the high-level financial information, and the buyer's had access to the seller asking questions, digging into the deal. By the way, those meetings will last anywhere from an hour to 4 hours between the seller and buyer. Once that meeting is over, we have trained the buyer in the discovery meeting to write a contingent letter of intent. Now, I want to stop right here and tell you that no, the buyer has not seen the seller's tax returns or financial statements at this point. They've seen the recast, which comes directly from those financial instruments. But we don't disclose tax returns because I don't know how many of you have ever looked at tax returns of a small business. If you can fully explain those to me, we have a job waiting for you. Tax returns are always set up to pay the minimum of taxes. So to just hand them to a buyer who has never owned a business before and ask them to understand it is a recipe for a disaster. So we don't get into the tax returns and the internal financial statements, but they are a part of the contingent letter of intent. That letter of intent says, I will pay this much for this business based on what I know, and this is how I will pay for it. This much down payment, this much in third-party financing, and Mr. Seller, I'd like for you to do some financing to demonstrate goodwill. As long as, and this is where the contingencies come in, as long as I get to examine and approve the last 3 years of financial statements, I get to examine and approve the furniture, fixture, and equipment list, and then you have somewhere between 8 and 10 contingencies, so that when the buyer signs that letter of intent, that contingent letter of intent, they're not buying the business, they're proposing to the seller, saying, would you like to get married? If you do, these are the contingents. So it's kind of like a prenup. I'll do this if these things are proven to be true. So the contingent letter of intent is a very important component to a deal. Amy? And we facilitate due diligence. Remember, I said that they haven't seen the tax returns. Now's the time to get into the tax returns. Our due diligence books are somewhere generally about that thick, because they contain leases, tax returns, P&Ls, equipment lists, key employee information. Everything that a buyer wants to know about that business is contained in the due diligence book. Then we have the due diligence meeting with the seller and the buyer, where the two of them go through these documents, so that if the buyer has a question, the seller is able to explain, oh, those dues that you see there, well, they're the Fayetteville Country Club. That's where I take my family, and it's not a necessary thing for the business, but here's the expense. This is what we do. So due diligence, we walk them through that in a way that allows the buyer to get all their questions answered. We store those due diligence documents also in a confidential deal room, and we will make them available to the buyer's CPA and their attorney as well. Due diligence is where most business deals fall apart. But the way that we do due diligence, 90+% of ours once get through due diligence because of the way we've prepared things. Amy? John, you want to pick that up?
Yeah. The next is the fun part. You always hear about, oh, that deal fell apart at the closing table or whatever. That's never happened with us, and the reason for that is because we're so prepared ahead of time. Everyone's seen the documents. Everyone's attorneys have seen the documents. We've made the necessary tweaks. We have the third-party closing attorney, so there's no one-sidedness there. And we just host the meeting. It sometimes takes 10 or 15 minutes, and we celebrate.